Welcome here. Glad you're here. We have crossed into another section of our New Testament. We have now gone through the Gospels. We have gone through the historical book of Acts. We have dealt with the Pauline epistles. And now we get into what we call the general epistles, which take us outside of the Pauline segment of the New Testament. And one more book left after the general epistles, and of course that's the final book of the New Testament, which is called the Revelation of Jesus Christ. So tonight we begin into the general, what we call the general epistles, and we will begin with this unique letter. It is a letter, although it's referred to often as the book of Hebrews, but it is an epistle, it is a letter, entitled Hebrews. And the unique part about this epistle, the unique part about this letter, is that we call it a unique commentary on the Old Testament. So far, as we've been going through the New Testament, there hasn't been a lot. There's been bits and pieces here where we've made connection back to the Old Testament. But the Epistle of the Hebrews, or the book of Hebrews, is basically a commentary for us on the Old Testament, because what it does is it interprets the Old Testament's history, it explains for us the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, and it also reveals the ultimate purpose of all of its institutions of worship, because it will talk about the Old Testament system of worship and compare that to the New Testament system of worship. And so this is why Hebrews occupies that unique place. Consider Jesus. This phrase is really the urgent appeal to the believers in the area that this letter is being written to. Consider Jesus is really the phrase that the letter writer is really encouraging the Hebrew Christians with, because what's happening is that they are turning their backs on Jesus because of the conditions that they find themselves in, and we'll get into that as we deal further with the letter. But consider Jesus is basically the key phrase, or the urgent phrase that we find in this letter. But before we get into its details, let's take a look at the 13 chapters of this book. And it's all about, as we take a look at the outline, it's all about superiority. All right? This is where the Hebrew writer goes to. The first 4 chapters, he talks about the superiority of the person of Christ. The person of Christ and his work is superior to that of those characters that we would find in the Old Testament, such as Moses, for example. All right? Then when we get into chapters 5 through 10, the Hebrew writer talks then about the superiority of the priesthood of Christ, comparing the Old Testament priesthood, talking about the high priest in the Old Testament, and comparing that with the priesthood ministry of Jesus Christ, and how Christ, again, is superior to the Old Testament priesthood. All right? So that by the time we get to chapters 11 through 13, the Hebrew writer then talks about the superiority of the paths of Christ, all right? And the fact that Christ and his ways are superior to what the Old Testament ways were. So that begins to give you an idea of the connection that Hebrews has with the Old Testament. It takes and helps us with the commentary of the Old Testament and helps us to place the Old Testament where it needs to be placed in the whole aspect of all of the scriptures when we talk about the 66 books and the effect that those scriptures have on us. So 13 chapters, not a long book, but one that if you took a chapter in a bit a day, you'd get through it in a week's time, no problem at all. But let's deal with some background issues here. Let's first of all talk about its title. The earliest manuscripts have the simple title Pro-Hebreos, which means simply to Hebrews. Now, we say that that's where the simple title that the earliest manuscripts have, because in the original, the title was probably not part of the original epistle. Okay? That title came as those copies were being made, and it was probably added by the church just to give distinction to the reader as to what this particular book was. Its date in which it was written, we're thinking in the interval between AD 65 and AD 70. We would accept that as the time when Hebrews was written. Now, what's significant again? If you remember about your history when we talked about it in the Old Testament, especially when we talked about it in the New Testament, what's significant about AD 70 again? You remember? What happened to Jerusalem? It was destroyed. The Roman Empire came and destroyed Jerusalem and its temple in AD 70. All right? Significant date in history. No mention of this in the book of Hebrews, to the Hebrews, all right? Which you would think, if it had happened, right, something would have been said in this letter, right, because of its significance. Nothing is said about it, right? So that helps us to understand its dating being somewhere between 65 and AD 70. And what Hebrews gives is the clear impression that the temple was still standing when the epistle was written. There's hints of it as you go to chapter 8, as you go to chapter 10. There's hints talking about the temple, the old system, all the rest of those things. And there is the hint that the removal of the temple services was not too far distant. It's almost as if the handwriting is on the wall. It's interesting if you jump up to chapter 12 and let's pick it up in verse 27 as we have on the screen there. Now this yet once more, this phrase that he's referring to, yet once more, indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. There's that hint there that something's on the brink, something's happening, something's changing, or change is coming, and the removal of the temple services, I think, is probably what the Hebrew writer is referring to there. So that the epistle was written as late as AD 65. It's supported by the observation that the readers of this epistle, right, were a second generation of Christians. All right, when you take a look at the first 4 verses, the Hebrew writer is talking about this next generation that has and is continuing on with the teachings of the forefathers. All right. And these were ones that probably had already passed away. So there's some hints there in the letter that kind of give us an idea of when this letter would have been written. But the intriguing thing that we talk most about with regard to the letter of Hebrews is who the author was. All right? The conclusion of Origen. He was an ancient church father. His name was Origen. This is what he said on the subject of the author of Hebrews, who wrote the epistle. In truth, God alone knows. All right, because we really do not know who wrote this book because of the fact that no name is mentioned, like in the Pauline epistles. Paul always talks about his authorship. Nothing like that in Hebrews. Now, there have been various authors that have been suggested over the centuries that this book has been studied. Of course, the most prominent theory being that the Apostle Paul was indeed the writer of the Hebrews, although his name is never mentioned here. But there are particular reasons why some think that Paul wrote this letter. For example, they would base their thought on the affinities of language and concepts between Hebrews and other Pauline epistles, and you do see that if you read through Hebrews. There are some phrases and some words that are used that are distinctly Pauline, all right, in their character. Also, they base this thought on the centrality of the person and the work of Christ in Hebrews, because in the Pauline epistles, he often talked right about the person and the work of Christ. So they kind of talk about that. They also base their theory on the fact of Paul's association with Timothy. And notice verse 23 in the final chapter of Hebrews. Notice what is written. Know that our brother Timothy has been set free, with whom I shall see you if he comes shortly. All right, so the mention of Timothy there seems to be, whoever the writer is, a familiarity with Timothy, and assumes that the recipients of his letter are familiar with Timothy as well. Also, they have talked about this distinct Pauline salutation, where we find that in verse 25 of the letter. It's the last verse of the letter. Notice, grace be with you all. Amen. Well, that's distinctly Pauline in its character, but that does not mean that it's Paul who wrote the letter. These phrases are common in the Pauline literature, It's very much possible that whoever the author was, if it was not Paul, picked up on these phrases and used them in the letter that he wrote or she wrote to because some think maybe possibly there was a woman who wrote this letter. But here's why some think it's Paul. Okay, now, as much as that argumentation seems to lean that way, I'm not convinced yet that it is Paul, and I'm not certain that we need to be concerned about being convinced. It's interesting to talk about because there's others who would say that the author of this letter was a co-worker of Paul. Hence the reasons for the Pauline phrases and the words that are used and so on. So, for example, if it was a co-worker of Paul, this would explain the Pauline and non-Pauline traits of the epistle. There's also other things in this epistle that we would say, no, that's not Pauline. That's unique in itself. So if it was a co-worker of Paul, that would explain those non-Pauline phrases and statements. So some think that it may have been Apollos, it could have been Luke, or even Barnabas. Those are names that have been suggested. These were all co-workers of Paul, and so it stands to reason perhaps they were involved in the writing of this book. And there's been others that have been suggested as well. These are what we call the least likely authors, but something worth talking about. So some have suggested it could have been Aquila. There's that female author there. Remember Priscilla and Aquila? Or no, Aquila was the male. Priscilla was the female. Anyway, but there are some that think it may have been a woman. So Aquila is included in that. Silas, remember Silas? Paul and Silas were together at the beginning of Paul's ministry. Philip the deacon, or even Clement of Rome, which is another early church father. All kinds of different ideas out there, all good for discussion, all good for speculation, but I certainly wouldn't want to get involved in an intense discussion on who the author was. Again, if the scriptures don't reveal to us who the author is, then I'm satisfied with that. And I think we need to be satisfied with that as well. But some interesting things to talk about as we take a look at this, again, unique letter itself. So who is it that the author of this letter is addressing? What group is being addressed here? And what's being addressed here is this single congregation of Hebrew Christians living somewhere in the Roman world. We do not know where. Okay, there's all kinds of speculation and hints and thoughts, but we really do not know. It's just they live somewhere in the Roman world. These are Hebrew Christians, and what we mean by Hebrew Christians, right, is that they were once in the Judaistic faith, or Judaism, right, and they have come and converted from that over into Christianity. Hebrew or Jewish Christians is what we're talking about here, all right? But what's more important than knowing where the readers live geographically is knowing where they fared spiritually. And this is the essence now of this letter. Because the author of this letter is going to focus in on the spiritual welfare of his recipients. He's not really worried about the geographical location. So, the many strong warnings of the epistle indicate to us that these Hebrew Christians were in what we would call a backslidden condition. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. They find themselves in a backslidden condition. What we mean by that is that they are in danger of apostatizing from Christ and returning to Judaism. All right? So, they have been steeped and trained in Judaism. They convert to Christ, okay, in Christianity, and now the threat is there that because of what they're having to endure for the name of Christ, it seems in some minds that it would be easier to revert back to Judaism and back to the old ways. Remember, Paul wrote about that to the Galatians. Remember that? Why would you go back to what you've just been freed from? Same kind of idea here. The threat of going back to and returning to Judaism. And the reason for that was because of the threat of persecution from without. There was an intimidation made to surrender, to go back to the old Judaistic ways, because at this point in time in history, the Roman authorities are tolerant of Judaism, but they are certainly not tolerant of Christianity. The Church of Christianity is that which is to be eliminated, okay? And so with that pressure, the persecution that's taking place at the hands of the Roman authorities, that's why some are thinking, if I go back to Judaism, I don't have to deal with that anymore. Okay? So that's the reason behind the address of this letter to these Hebrew Christians. So when we get into the purposes then, someone has said that Hebrews was written to rekindle a dampened fire. All right? For all kinds of different reasons. The zeal and the excitement about being a Christian, being a follower of Christ, wasn't there anymore. And this letter was designed to try to rekindle that fire. And so this is why we say that the letter of Hebrews was the response or the sounding forth, and there was basically two issues or two ways in which they talked about rekindling this dampened fire. One way was through teaching. All right? The first 4 verses of chapter 1 in Hebrews tells us that the epistle's main teaching was about 3 vital subjects. Now, before we get there, let's take a look at those first 4 verses that we find in Hebrews chapter 1. Notice what's written here. I'm in verse 1 of chapter 1. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become so much better than the angels, as he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. So in those first 4 verses, we see 3 vital subjects that are involved in this teaching that the writer of the Hebrew letter will do. The first being revelation. All right? In the sense that the written revelation of God that this Hebrew writer is referring to over the centuries has come in 2 groups. This revelation has come in 2 groups. What do you think those 2 groups are? The Old Testament and the New Testament. All right? And this is what this Hebrew writer is going to do. He's going to help them understand that the revelation of God came not only in various ways spoken in time past by the fathers, by the prophets, Old Testament, okay, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds. There's the New Testament, Jesus Christ. Okay? So this teaching of revelation comes in those 2 forms, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Also, he's going to be talking about in this teaching a person. Hebrews is the most comprehensive New Testament book portraying Christ as the Son of God and, most importantly, and we'll get into this a little later, the Son of Man. Okay? And we'll see what that means and what the significance of that is as we go along a little further. So, 3 vital subjects that are going to be taught. The revelation of God, the person, right, of Jesus Christ, but not only the person, but also the work of Christ. Because the subjects of Christ's once for all sacrifice, okay? Remember the sacrifice that was so important on the Day of Atonement? That was yearly. What's the significance about Christ's sacrifice? It's once for all. It doesn't have to be repeated. It was done once, sufficient for all. So this subject of Christ's once for all sacrifice and his continuing ministries, right? He continues to minister as priest and king. It all pervades this book. And so this is the teaching that is going to come from the author of this book to the Hebrew Christians. All right? In the factor that this is going to help rekindle this dampened fire as they are taught these truths about Christ. Okay? In case of both Old and New Testaments. But also what's happening here as well is that there's warning and exhortation too. The warnings concern just recompense for sinning against God. Okay, and the Hebrew writer is very clear on this. The exhortations are positive appeals and encouragement to what we say to appropriate the power and the privilege of Christ's children. and incentives to press on to fuller stature as Christians. So here's this two-pronged approach that the Hebrew writer is doing in his letter. He's going to teach them the truths about Christ and how he is better than the Old Testament system. And he's also going to warn them about the fact that, listen, if you turn back from what you say that you professed in faith, there's grave consequences to that. Rather than doing that, let's encourage you to keep the faith and keep the faith strong. Okay? So those warnings and exhortations are involved in there as well. So when you get those when you get that two-pronged approach going in your mind when you read through Hebrews, that helps you then understand further some of the statements and some of the claims that are made as the Hebrew writer writes this letter. Okay? Because he's teaching and he's warning and he's exhorting as he goes through this letter. All right? Any questions there before we go a little further?
Do these Christians, was there nobody there to help encourage them to follow within their body?
There was, yes, but outside help was needed. Yeah, which is often the case, right? Sometimes outside help is needed, and that's what the writer of this letter is doing. The outside help, per se, right? Because of what they're enduring and working through. All right. Any other questions there? So it's really when you begin to get an idea of the overall strategy of the letter writer, that helps then to understand some of the things that are written here then. Now, the place that this book has in the Bible itself is significant. In fact, we would say it occupies a very important place in the Scriptures. Some would say, well, all the books of the Bible have an important place, but Hebrews especially. And basically, what we're saying here is that this book is the Spirit. And when we're talking about the Spirit here, we're talking about the Holy Spirit, right? It's the Spirit's commentary, basically, on the Pentateuch. What's the Pentateuch? If you remember, way back in our Old Testament studies, the Pentateuch is what? Do you remember?
First 5 books.
First 5 books of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? The law of God. Okay? So what the Holy Spirit does with this letter to the Hebrews is he basically gives now a commentary on those first 5 books, but especially the book of Leviticus. If you remember Leviticus, the content of Leviticus basically dealt with, right, the ceremonial law, right? The way in which they worship, the sacrificial system, the Day of Atonement, in Leviticus chapter 16, all the rest of those things, all right? The Hebrew writer addresses those things that the Hebrew Christians are very familiar with when it comes to the Pentateuch in the Old Testament, all right? So what this does then, what Hebrews does, is it makes clear that all the ceremonial laws that were given in the Old Testament, right, such as the offerings of sacrifices, the ministrations of the priests, right, and all the different sacrifices that they had to be an authority over, what these were, and this is what the Hebrew writer is talking about here, what these were types pointing forward to Christ. So let's take a simple example. The Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16. Remember? Where the lamb, right, is sacrificed for the sins of the people. Right? The blood is shed for the atoning of the sins of the people. The blood of the lamb is sprinkled upon the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle or temple. Right? That all is what the Hebrew writer is talking about here now. When he talks about it in Hebrews, he says this all points forward to Christ. Because who's the lamb? Jesus Christ. What did he do? He shed his blood. Why did he shed his blood? To atone for the sins of the people. But rather than having to do it yearly like they did back in Leviticus, it only has to be done once for all. Christ did it once for all. Okay, so that's the pointing forward part, and then the part where the great sacrifice for sin, the true priest, the one mediator between God and people, now is the superior way of realizing relationship with God, rather than the old sacrificial system, right? The way of God with his people in the New Testament compared to the way of God in the Old Testament. What's better? Christ. Christ is better. Okay? So this is what the Hebrew writer is doing with his letter. That's why Hebrews has been referred to as the fifth gospel. We often talk about the four gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Hebrews has often been referred to as the fifth gospel. Why? Because it tells of Jesus' finished work on earth and his continuing work in heaven. When you think about the four gospels, where do they end? They end with Christ ascending, right? But that's where it ends. It doesn't say anything further. Now what the Hebrew writer does is take the action of Jesus and talk about how that is the finished work of Christ, but how Christ also is continuing his work even today. Hebrews takes us a little further in understanding what Jesus does now. We know well what he did in the past, but what is he doing now? The Hebrew writer helps us with it. Okay? So that's why it's called often called the fifth gospel. When we take Hebrews and we compare them to other New Testament books, compare it with Romans, and you find some interesting things here. Romans was the first of the Pauline epistles that we looked into, right? When we got into that section of the New Testament. Now let's take a look at the first epistle of the general epistles, Hebrews, okay? First epistles of either section. And let's do a little comparison, because Hebrews indeed is often compared with Romans. Hebrews presents, for example, the person of salvation. The person of salvation being who? Jesus Christ. Romans presents the way of salvation. If you remember back in our study in Romans, it helps us understand how Christ saves us, right? Or the way Christ saves us. Hebrews focuses on the ceremonial law of the Old Testament, helping us to understand that Jesus is superior to that. Romans talks about and focuses on the moral law of all time. Remember, he talks about in Romans, Paul talks about the law of Christ, okay, and the distinction that makes. So it's interesting when you take Hebrews and you take Romans, you can compare them, right? It's interesting those comparisons that are there. Questions, thoughts there as we take a look now at the background of Hebrews. All right, so that gives us some background. Let's talk about its prominent subjects and some of the things that we find here. Of course, the number one topic here being the person and the work of Jesus Christ. The Hebrew writer basically talks about it this way. The main purpose of Hebrews is Jesus. Let's talk about Jesus. You're thinking of going back into the old ways, into Judaism. Let's talk about Jesus again. And let's talk about what he has done and what he continues to do in helping you understand the folly of going back into the old ways. The author of the epistle, what he's convinced of is that all that is necessary to restrain from apostasy, and what we mean by apostasy is going from what you said that you've embraced and going back to the old ways. Okay? What he says here is that the way in which we restrain from apostasy, is to hold up Christ. Focus on Christ. Focus on him and all of the dignity and the beauty of his person, and in the importance of his work and what it is that he has done for us, and especially what he continues to do for us. It's not just a case of swapping out ideologies. What we're talking about here is you're looking at not just turning your back on a system. No. You're turning your back on a person. You're turning your back on the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And it's much more than just a system. Okay? We're talking about the person and the work of Jesus Christ. That's why when the Hebrew writer is writing his letter, he talks often about the superiority of Jesus. This word that keeps being repeated in this letter over and over and over again is this key word called better, or this key word better. When you read through Hebrews, take a look and see how many times that word better pops up in your reading. And the reason why this key word is used is because the author emphasizes here for us the superiority of Jesus, especially again regarding salvation. Because basically what he does, he says, listen, what does the Old Testament system do for you? Does it save you? No. Doesn't save you at all. This is why Jesus is better than the Old Testament system. Jesus saves you. The Old Testament system of sacrifices doesn't save you. I mean, Paul even talked about that in his letter too, especially to the Romans, remember? No flesh is justified by the what? By the law. Okay? So he emphasizes, the Hebrew writer emphasizes this. And so what the epistle does is presents a series of contrasts between the good things of Judaism, all right, and the better things of Christ. Notice we didn't say the bad things of Judaism, because that's not what the Hebrew writer talks about. He says, yeah, for a time, that was good stuff. But remember the purpose of it. It was to all point us to Christ. That's the purpose of why we had that system. It was all designed to point us to Christ. What's better than this is Jesus. Okay? And that's why he then talks about the superiority of Jesus. Now, again, notice we have contrasts mentioned here, right? Between the good things of Judaism and the better things of Jesus Christ. There are several contrasts that this letter exposes and deals with that we want to do a quick review of. For example, he first of all talks about the contrast between the Son and angels, Son being Jesus Christ here, okay, and how Jesus is better than the angels, okay. Not only better than the angels, but also chapter 3 talks about the Son being better than Moses. Now that was a statement, because in the Jewish mind, who was Moses? He was the greatest prophet of all, right? He was the one that led the nation of Israel out of bondage, out of Egypt, and into the promised land. How dare you talk about somebody being better than Moses? But indeed, that's who Jesus is. Jesus is better than Moses. He talks about and brings contrast in chapters 3 and 4, talking about Canaan rest as compared to God's rest. When he's talking about Canaan rest, he's talking specifically about, okay, the people of Israel now entering into the promised land and realizing their rest there, but God's rest is even better than Canaan's rest, and brings that contrast out. He brings a contrast between Christ and Aaron. Who do we mean by Aaron? Do you remember? Yeah, he was the first high priest, right, of the Jewish system. He was related to Moses, remember? Okay, Moses and Aaron worked together, right? And Christ, in his priestly duties, in his priestly work, is better even than the original high priest, Aaron himself. He brings contrast between what we would call spiritual infancy and maturity, all right? Where he basically says, you know, you as Hebrew Christians, you should be able to deal with and be involved in the meat of the things of God. But you're not there. You're still in the infancy stage, and there has to be a progression in their spiritual maturing. He contrasts apostasy with faithfulness, right? And the factor of apostasy is the turning back from the way, where faithfulness is continuing on in the way, even though the going gets tough. And of course, he draws the contrast between the Old and New Covenants, right? The Old Testament, New Testament. Even the offerings of the law and the offerings of Christ, he brings that contrast. Again, he said these offerings of the law, they had to be done regularly, they had to be done yearly. But the sacrifice of Christ, done once for all. In fact, when you get into chapter 10, notice how many times that phrase is used. Once for all. Once for all, once for all. That's one of those contrasts that the Hebrew writer brings out. He contrasts faithful sight. Okay? He even contrasts Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. Mount Zion being what? What is another name for Mount Zion? Jerusalem. Okay? So, those contrasts are there in this letter, and this letter is full of those contrasts. Take that list, and as you read through Hebrews, see where you come across those contrasts and how that is brought out by the letter writer. Of course, the Hebrew writer refers to Christ as the Son of God. That takes us right to the very beginning of the letter again, and takes us through to the 4th verse of chapter 2. This is the opening segment of the letter, and what the author is doing here is he's revealing and talking about Christ as the Son of God is that he's revealing the dignity, he's revealing the exalted nature of the author of Christianity. Again, Christianity is not just an idea. The Old Testament system was an idea, right? But Christianity, Jesus being the Son of God, this is not an idea. We're talking now again about a person. We're talking about this person's work. But he also refers to Christ as the Son of Man. Okay? And this is significant in his own right. Because what he does here is he shows that Christ is the Son of Man, and he is the Son of Man to be the people's Redeemer, because what does he do? He tastes death for everyone. We see that in verse 9 of chapter 2. His death, again, we're talking about the fact that it is a phenomenon of God in the flesh. Remember, the one who has always existed, never will end. He has no beginning, he has no end. This concept of God dying. But why does he die? So that he tastes death for everyone, as the Hebrew writer talks about in verse 9. In fact, we see it here in verse 9 of chapter 2. But we see Jesus, who is made a little lower than the angels, talking about his incarnation, right? For the suffering of death. This is why he was made a little lower than the angels. For the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, notice, and I've always found this phrase very interesting, that he might, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone. Isn't that an interesting way of putting it? That by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. Okay? That God would experience the penalty of sin, even though he had no sin. But he experiences that, and this is why he's referred to as the Son of Man. He is the one, the man Christ lived before people. As a man, he died, right? And as the Son of Man, he appears now in the presence of God for who? For you and me. For who? That's the significance of him not only being called the Son of God, right? But also called the Son of Man. He represents us before God. That's his continuing ministry. Now that the finished work of Christ on the cross and the resurrection is now complete, he continues to minister on our behalf as the Son of Man. The Hebrew writer also talks about Christ being the high priest. Okay, and this is significant. In fact, this takes up a large section of the letter of Hebrews. Remember, in Judaism, the office of high priest was the highest religious office. This office was not available to everyone. This office was only available to a certain segment, a certain family line of the Jewish nation. Okay? So to have this position meant you had the highest religious office. And what the Hebrew writer does is he seeks to show that Christianity also has a high priest. And the high priest that Christianity has is one who is superior in every way to the high priest of Judaism. So he's even superior to Aaron and all of what he was able to do. So, in this long section of the epistle, what the author does is he shows the superiority of the person in the ministry of Christ as the high priest. Okay? You can't get a better high priest than him, is basically what the Hebrew writer is saying. So, again, when you're talking about turning from Christianity and going back to the old ways of Judaism, understand you're going back to an inferior way. Because Jesus is superior to the high priest, Jesus is superior to Moses, he's superior to angels, he's superior to all this. When you realize that, why would you want to turn from that and go back to the old way? It doesn't make any sense in the mind of the Hebrew writer. Okay? He'll also take some time in this letter to talk about rest for the believer. Okay? And this all comes from the idea that we remember that life's incomparable blessings come only from Christ. Right? And this is the point that the Hebrew writer is making in his letter. That these incomparable blessings of God, they come only from Christ. The first blessings in Christ is salvation itself. Right? that, or another word we would give it is redemption. There is no salvation in the Old Testament system. There's no salvation found in the sacrificial system. There's no salvation found in the high priest of the Old Testament. There's no salvation found in those old ways. Salvation and the blessings of salvation only come from one source, and that is from Christ himself. Only the redeemed one, the believer, right, can enjoy life in its fullness, which is abundant life or rest, right? That's why rest in Christianity is superior to the Old Testament rest of Canaan, the Promised Land. So he talks about rest there in that regard. But we have to, if you're going to deal with Hebrews, okay, we also have to deal with these, what we call the warning sections. There are 5 major warning sections in the book of Hebrews, all right? These are warnings that the Hebrew writer writes to the Hebrew Christians. It says, listen, you say that you've come from the old system and you've now adopted, or you've now embraced, you've appropriated faith in Christ. Now think about this for a moment. If you're going to turn your back on that and go back to the old way, that has some very grave consequences to it. If it's even, in the words of the Hebrew writer, if it's even possible to be able to do that. And this is really how these warning sections come down. The judgments that are brought into relation with these warning sections have created lots of challenges. In fact, for many Bible students, these are what we would call the most difficult passages to understand. And that's especially due to the fact that the warnings of judgment are so severe. And basically what the Hebrew writer says is, listen, if you turn from this and go back to the old way, how could you? It's impossible for you to even be able to return. What you're doing, if you're turning your back on this and going back to the old way, is you're rejecting all of what Christ has done and will do for you. How is it possible for you to do that? Not only how is it possible, but how is it possible, if you were to do that, to escape the judgment that comes with it? Right? Of rejecting Christ. Outright. Because of whatever reason that you think justifies going back to the old way. These are passages that have been dealt with, written about, argued over, debated, studied for centuries. And we don't have the time, nor is the purpose of this study to get into all of that. But know this, that that's a major section of Hebrews that needs to be dealt with when you study the letter. The last thing that we're going to talk about with regard to prominent subjects in this letter is the examples of faith, of course, chapter 11. And the first 2 verses of chapter 12 we call it the Hall of Faith, right? The writer of Hebrews gives us a definition of what faith is, and then gives us examples of people who exemplify that. So by faith Abel, by faith Enoch, by faith Noah, by faith Abraham, by faith Moses, by faith, well, before we get even to Moses, we have to talk about Sarah, right? All these ones who were examples of what it meant to live by faith, and as they lived by faith, how they dealt with the issues of their lifetime that they dealt with. I mean, even Abel is talked about, right? Before even all the other ones are talked about, and how they were examples of faith, and how then their example spurs us, or ought to spur us on in our faith, right? And following Christ. Again, remember the context in which the Hebrew writer is writing this. There's these people who are wanting to turn their back on following Christ and go back to the old way. Well, notice all the examples that he gives of those who live by faith are all the ones that were in the Old Testament. Okay? And he talks about them in that context. And the fact that they knew what it meant to live by faith, and how that is to be an example for us. Questions, thoughts there before we go any further?
It makes me think of, those people in the Old Testament that they saw something better.
Yeah.
And they believed it, just, you know that, but just sometimes the light bulb comes on it.
Yeah.
And what an amazing thing, all that way back, and they continued on, and didn't lose faith. And you know, for people to go back, I mean, to the Old Testament times, it was laborious. And as opposed to what we are living in now in the New Testament, God's made it so easy. We don't have to do all those works that really don't do us any good in the end.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
it's amazing.
He's taking care of it all for us, right? Yeah, and so, again, the question is, well, then why would you go back to those old ways? It doesn't make any sense. So we're finding that this letter is quite significant, right? It is very significant in our study of not just the New Testament, but very significant in our faith walk as believers in Christ. That's why when we get to the so what question, which we always do, right, we find some things here to remind us as to how not only the significance of the letter for the time in which it was written and for the recipients in which it was written for, but also its significance for us as well. For example, this epistle gives various warnings about backsliding, right? And those are good warnings for us to heed to, because just as they were prone to want to go back to the old ways, is that not what we are prone to sometimes do as well, right? We often, as people, this seems to be how we're wired, we often as people, when we begin to deal with breaking new ground, when we begin to forge ahead in uncharted territories, when we begin to deal with the issues of life that we had not anticipated or counted on, don't we find that the easiest thing for us to do is to go back to the way things were? Or we at least have that desire to go back to the way things were, thinking that that's the better way. And what Hebrews reminds us of and warns us about is, listen, if you're planning on going back to the way things were, you're not going to like the results of that. Because again, our minds have a way of tricking us in thinking about and being nostalgic and thinking of only the good things that were back in those days and forgetting about the things that were really back in those days that we'd forgotten. Okay? So this epistle is really good in helping us to be mindful of that and to be very careful in that area. Don't wish for the way in which things were. Don't wish for that phrase again, good old days, right? You'll find that there were things there that you'll be reminded of that weren't so good. And we need to continue forging ahead in our faith rather than going back to the way things were or the way in which things were comfortable, right? Hebrews also reminds us of the necessity of taking a spiritual inventory. I think this is healthy for us to do on a regular basis. To take a spiritual inventory where we actually ask the question, okay, where I began in my faith walk and where I now am in my faith walk, how far have I come? Or even in my evaluation or my taking stock, right? Have I come to a certain point but have digressed to another point? I think it's good and healthy for us to take stock of what is happening for us spiritually, taking that spiritual inventory whereby we do a real honest evaluation before God. This is really where I'm at. Where do I need to be? And how do I get there? Or where have I digressed to? And how do I get back out of that and progress and gain further? The Hebrew letter helps us and reminds us of that very important factor, because that's basically what the Hebrew writer is telling the Hebrew Christians. Take stock of where you are. What's changed? Why are you wanting to go back? What's the result if you do? All the rest of those things, where they are forced to take a spiritual inventory as well. The other thing that this book does for us, though, is this. It gives us a good indication of the current, notice I put the word current there, of the current intercessory ministry of Christ. Sometimes we get lulled into just thinking, you know what, Christ came, He died, He rose again. And we leave it there. And we forget about the fact that, no, he did all those things. It's true. But he didn't stop there. And what Hebrews reminds us of is what Christ continues and currently, today, does for us now. Okay? He's interceding for us before the Father. That's one of the prime things that he does today. Not what he has done, but what he does today. By the way, as he gives us tomorrow, will do that for us again tomorrow. Right? It jars us from that point or that lull in our lives where we are satisfied to sit, understanding the finished work of Christ, without recognizing what Christ wants us to continue to do and grow in our life as he continues to work and intercede for us, and empower us, and enable us, and equip us. And so that's why it's important then for us, right? If we want to know what Christ is doing for us today, well, it's good to be in here, right? To help us understand. Hebrews in here helps us to understand what Christ is doing for us today. So we're not stuck in that, because we know that what Christ is also coming again. There's lots he's doing in the interval between his resurrection and his coming again. Okay? He's active today, and Hebrews reminds us of that good factor. So, there you go. The letter to the Hebrew Christians, or what we most fondly call this book, Hebrews. All right? Not talking about coffee. We're talking about the Hebrew Christians and what Jesus is doing for them and what he also does for us. Enjoy it as you read through it this week. And when we get together next time, we'll take another look at another general epistle. All right, let's pray together. Father, thanks again for your word, how it encourages us and challenges us. And Hebrews especially does that for us today. As we read and as we comprehend, help us, Father, to rejoice not just in the things that you've done, but what you especially continue to do as you are involved in our lives even today. We pray it in Jesus' name.